Greetings, fellow time travelers. My name is Christian Ryan with Archetype Publishing, and today's talk is entitled, Did Dinosaurs Really Have Feathers? A Biblical Perspective on the Feathered Dinosaur Debate. Dinosaurs are absolutely fascinating animals. They were first recognized as a unique group of creatures from fossil discoveries made in the 1820s. The word dinosaur itself means terrible lizard. That name gives us some insight into how people originally imagined these animals as huge, hulking beasts. Early reconstructions often portrayed dinosaurs as sluggish, almost lizard-like animals. Like modern reptiles, they were ectothermic or cold-blooded, meaning they had to bask in the sun in order to generate energy. They could only thrive in hot, wet, swamp-like environments. Many of the largest species were so massive that they could not even support their own body weight on land. They were imagined as living primarily in the water, like hippos or whales today. Nowadays, scientists understand that dinosaurs lived a lot more like modern birds and mammals than modern reptiles. They lived very active lives and could move about quickly. And they thrived in a wide variety of environments, including seasonal ones that could get quite cold. One dinosaur, in particular, helped us to get this new understanding on a roll, that being Velociraptor. Made famous by its appearance in the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World films, Velociraptor helped flip the script on what makes a dinosaur a dinosaur. It was an agile, fast-moving, active predator. It didn't just walk or amble about. It could run after its prey, using its long, stiff tail for balance. Discoveries like these taught paleontologists to reevaluate dinosaurs as a whole. There is one problem with this narrative, though. The dinosaur I'm talking about is actually not a velociraptor. Velociraptor, as it appears in the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World movies, is represented here in orange as a predator tall enough to look a full-grown man in the eye. But the real velociraptor, shown here as the green silhouette, was actually much smaller. The raptors used in the film were actually based on a closely related dinosaur called Deinonychus. Deinonychus, the species that actually caused scientists to rethink what we thought we knew about dinosaurs, was discovered in the 1960s. Velociraptor itself was discovered much earlier in the 1920s. And at the time, was known from far more incomplete fossil remains. While the author Michael Crichton was writing the original Jurassic Park novel, some scientists proposed that Velociraptor and Deinonychus belonged to the same genus. Velociraptor was named first, so its name would have priority. That's why Crichton used Velociraptor as the name for the raptors in his book. That hypothesis did not gain acceptance, and today Velociraptor and Deinonychus are recognized as separate genera. Nevertheless, Velociraptor's portrayal in the first Jurassic Park novel and film cemented it in the public imagination as a human-sized predator. There is, however, another major difference between the movie Velociraptor and the real animal. Today, most scientifically accurate reconstructions depict Velociraptor as being covered in feathers. Rather than being a scaly, two-legged lizard, most scientists think it resembled a flightless bird, something closer to an eagle or a hawk. And Velociraptor is not unique in this respect. Many dinosaurs are now commonly portrayed as covered in feathers. This idea has become widespread among scientists and in popular culture. Even in the 2022 film Jurassic World Dominion, there were several dinosaurs featured covered in feathers. Today, most paleontologists accept that at least some dinosaurs had feathers. Despite broad scientific acceptance, not everyone agrees that dinosaurs had feathers. In particular, this topic remains rather controversial among young-age creationists. Young-age creationists hold that the events and timeline described in the book of Genesis are historically accurate, with God creating all kinds of life on Earth less than 10,000 years ago. Some creationists, myself included, accept the existence of feathered dinosaurs. Others do not. This disagreement is particularly evident among the big three creationist organizations: Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and the Institute for Creation Research. It should be noted that not everyone who disagrees with the concept of feathered dinosaurs is a young age creationist. There are a few old age affirming scientists who also reject feathered dinosaurs, such as Dr. Alan Fiducia, a researcher specializing in fossil birds. However, as previously stated, this view is not mainstream among most old age scientists. Individuals who reject feathered dinosaurs often argue that these creatures can be categorized into one of two groups. In group one are actually birds with some reptile like features. This would include creatures like Archaeopteryx. In group two, we have animals that everyone agrees are dinosaurs, but are fossilized with features that have simply been misidentified as feathers, but instead perhaps are decayed connective tissues, often described as frayed collagen fibers. This would include creatures like Sinosauropteryx and Eutyrannus. Let's now go into some actual quotes from each of the three big creationist organizations to get a better understanding of where they're coming from regarding this topic. I do want to specify before going into this that I have relationships with individuals from each of these organizations and consider many of them colleagues and brothers and sisters in Christ. According to this article from Answers in Genesis, dinosaurs had no feathers, and claiming they did actually requires reliance on evolutionary interpretations of fossils that should not be accepted by creationists. In this article from Creation Ministries International, the authors of this article state some researchers, including creation paleontologists, accept feathered dinosaurs partly on the basis of detailed secular descriptions. Conversely, some creation scientists with expertise in other disciplines remain unconvinced that those secular descriptions have eliminated enough evolutionary bias to legitimize feathered dinosaurs as a Genesis-friendly category. The Institute for Creation Research has specifically criticized the depiction of feathered dinosaurs in Jurassic World Dominion, stating, "Wild imagination abounds in the new Jurassic World Dominion movie. Even a fully feathered dinosaur is shown swimming below the ice at one point. But this is similar to the outlandish ideas published in the world's best paleontology journals. The movie portrays these fanciful ideas on the big screen." And now we're going to briefly turn back to Answers in Genesis for an article that hits rather close to home for me. In this particular paper, the author mentions me specifically and an article I wrote about Archaeopteryx a few years ago on the New Creation blog. Dr. Mark Surtees's work and ideas have influenced students to keep propagating and basing their views on evolutionary-based definitions. That is the case for an article published by a geology student in the New Creation blog, Ryan 2022. Clearly, this is a very controversial issue within young age creationism. But why? Feathers are frequently cited as evidence that birds evolved from a group of meat-eating dinosaurs called theropods. Most old age scientists believe that every living thing on the planet can be linked back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. Birds represent one branch of the theropod lineage. Because of this, some creationists worry that acknowledging feathers in dinosaurs compromises a biblical worldview. On the one hand, I can understand the concern. We can clearly see from Scripture that birds and non-avian or non-bird dinosaurs do not share common ancestry. The book of Genesis says that God created flying animals like birds on the fifth day of creation. Land animals like dinosaurs were created on the sixth day. Even if you wanted to try and argue that each day in the creation week represents an indefinite period of time or millions of years, the order is still wrong. Birds come into existence before land animals like dinosaurs do. So clearly, the idea that a lineage of non-avian theropods gave rise to birds is contrary to Scripture. In this talk, I hope to clear up a lot of the confusion surrounding this topic. We will begin by clarifying some basic definitions: what qualifies as a dinosaur, what qualifies as a bird, and what actually counts as a feather. Next, we'll turn to the fossil record and examine the evidence for feathers in dinosaurs and other extinct creatures. From there, we'll look at why these discoveries challenge our modern categories and how the Bible's framework of creation, according to kinds, helps make sense of that pattern. Finally, we will explore what our relatively new branch of study, Baraminology, reveals about feathered dinosaurs and consider what all of this means for our biblical creation framework. If you've been to the grocery store lately, you probably remember seeing those little bags of plastic toy dinosaurs. But there's a problem. Some of the dinosaurs in the bag are not actually dinosaurs. Some of these little guys are actually imposters. The little animal with wings there is a flying reptile called a pterosaur, and the long-necked one with flippers is a marine reptile called a plesiosaur. But they look like dinosaurs, don't they? So why don't we just keep things simple and call them dinosaurs? A lot of people think dinosaurs are a single type of animal, like a dog, cat, or horse. But that's not true. Dinosaurs are a very diverse group of animals, kind of like how mammal is a diverse group of animals. You don't just have one type of mammal, right? You've got horses, elephants, whales, bats, platypus, kangaroos, and loads more. Dinosaurs have a similar range of diversity. You've got big ones, small ones, plant eaters, predators, fast ones, slow ones, and everything in between. But despite all of that diversity, dinosaurs share a number of defining traits. These are the features that make dinosaurs, well, dinosaurs. There is a whole set of traits we could go into, but for the sake of time, I am going to keep things brief and just discuss two. Number one, dinosaur legs are positioned directly beneath their bodies. This is very unlike what we see with modern reptiles, as their legs sprawl out to the sides. But in dinosaurs, they held their legs a lot like how most mammals do today. The next trait has to do with the hip socket. In most animals, the hip socket is enclosed in a cup or bowl-like shape that the head of the femur, or upper leg bone, fits into. But in dinosaurs, the hip socket is open. This means that the femur head fits into an open ring, not a closed cup. We call this feature a perforated acetabulum. A lot of people get the idea that reptiles like crocodiles and lizards are modern-day dinosaurs. I mean, just look at this Jackson's chameleon on the right. It's got 3 horns on its head, just like a miniature triceratops. So it must be a dinosaur, right? Well, actually not. As we just discussed, true dinosaurs carry their legs directly underneath their body, and they have an open hip socket. Crocodiles and lizards have neither of these features. So despite the somewhat dinosaur-like appearance, modern reptiles are not dinosaurs. Here we have some additional animals that people often mistake for dinosaurs. On the left is a pterosaur, or flying reptile. Interestingly, pterosaurs did walk with their legs positioned directly underneath their bodies, much like dinosaurs. However, they are still not dinosaurs because they lack an open hip socket. On the right is a marine reptile called a plesiosaur. Their bodies were built quite differently from dinosaurs. Instead of limbs useful for walking on land, they had flippers. Plus, they also lacked the skeletal features that define true dinosaurs, like the open hip socket. The animal on the bottom here is also not a dinosaur. It's a dimetrodon, and I want to draw a little bit of attention to it because we'll be seeing it later in the lecture. Dimetrodon looks sort of like a reptile, and for a while, that's indeed what we thought it was. But scientists have taken a closer look at its anatomy and discovered that, yes, some of its features do resemble those of reptiles, but others resemble those of mammals. So Dimetrodon here really isn't a reptile or a mammal, it's what we call a non-mammalian synapsid, an almost mammal, if you will. Unfortunately, defining the term bird is a bit more complicated, even amongst old-age evolutionary scientists who accept feathered dinosaurs. Some researchers prefer a broader definition that includes long-tailed varieties like Archaeopteryx. Others, myself included, restrict the term bird to a group sometimes called Avibravicata, which means short-tailed birds. For the sake of clarity, I will be using the term bird in a manner consistent with the more restricted definition. With that out of the way, birds are a diverse group containing more than 10,000 living species alive today, and several more in the fossil record. Birds are feathered animals with forelimbs shaped into wings. They also have a shortened bony tail ending in a fused structure called a pygostyle. You can see it illustrated here, represented under the number 17. We've mentioned feathers quite a lot in this presentation so far, so we should probably define that term as well. Feathers are hollow structures that grow directly out of the skin and form a distinctive covering over the animal's body. In many ways, feathers are a lot like hair. They're even both made out of a material called keratin, which is also what forms your fingernails. But feathers can be distinguished from hair in that they are made out of a special type of keratin called beta keratin. When you hear the word feather, a particular image probably pops into your mind. But not all feathers are the same. There are several different types of feathers, and each one serves a particular purpose. For example, wing and tail feathers are used to help the bird attain lift and can maintain control during flight. Sometimes, they are also used for display purposes. You can think about a peacock's tail feathers, for example. Contour feathers are the outer layer of feathers that cover a bird's body. They are what give the bird its overall shape and streamlined form. Down and semi-plume feathers are really soft and fluffy. They form the underlying layer of feathers on a bird's body and primarily serve to keep the animal warm. Now, despite not looking anything like a stereotypical feather, bristles and phyloplumes are indeed feathers. Phyloplumes act as sensors that help the bird detect the position and movement of their outer feathers. They function sort of like whiskers do on mammals. Bristles are stiff, hair-like feathers often found around the eyes or mouth, where they provide protection and sensory feedback, much like our eyelashes. With that groundwork laid, we can finally turn to the fossil record. Do we actually find fossils of dinosaurs preserved with feathers? Let's take a look at our first case study, Sinosauropteryx. Sinosauropteryx is a small, chicken-sized creature found in the Liaoning province of China. We can clearly see that this animal is a non-avian dinosaur. It has toothed jaws rather than a beak, clawed forelimbs instead of wings, and a long, bony tail. Several specimens of Sinosauropteryx preserve a fuzzy, down-like body covering rather than scales. This covering closely resembles the down feathers you might see on a baby bird today. As I mentioned earlier, some researchers have suggested that these structures are not feathers at all, but connective tissues, such as collagen fibers in the skin that have started to fray during the process of decomposition. However, Sinosauropteryx specimens do not support this interpretation. This is because these hair-like structures contain melanosomes, microscopic structures involved in pigmentation. Collagen fibers do not contain pigment, whereas feathers do. This strongly indicates that the preserved structures are indeed fossilized, down-like feathers. Because Sinosauropteryx lacked proper wings, these feathers were most likely used for insulation rather than flight. Next up, we have Beipiaosaurus. Also discovered in China, this dinosaur was about the size of a large black bear. Fossil specimens show that Beipiaosaurus had at least two types of feathers covering its body. One consisted of short, slender, down-like feathers, similar to those seen in Sinosauropteryx. The other consisted of broader, branching feathers. Beipiaosaurus fossils are so well preserved that we don't just have bones and feathers, we also have preserved skin. A recent study examining the skin of this and other feathered dinosaurs from China found that it was smooth and lacked reptile-style scales. The study also showed that these animals had dandruff. They shed their skin in small flakes rather than large sheets of skin like we see in lizards and snakes. This pattern of skin shedding closely resembles what we see in birds and mammals today. The largest feathered dinosaur we have discovered so far is called Eutyrannus, meaning feathered tyrant. If the tyrant part of its name sounds familiar, that's because it is a cousin of Tyrannosaurus rex. Fossils of Eutyrannus have been found with extensive coverings of down-like feathers, some measuring up to 5 inches long. The discovery of this animal led a lot of us in the paleontological community to wonder if other large tyrannosaurs, like T. rex itself, might have also been covered in feathers. Today, this doesn't appear to have been the case. Fossilized skin impressions from T. rex have been found showing scaly skin. That suggests it was primarily covered in scales rather than feathers. So why is T. rex covered in scaly skin while Eutyrannus is covered in feathers? This might have something to do with the environment they were living in. From fossils of plants and animals found with it, T. rex is thought to have lived in a semi-tropical environment. But Eutyrannus is thought to have lived in a more seasonal environment. In these colder conditions, a feathered coat would have helped the animal with insulation. All of the theropod dinosaurs we've discussed so far had down-like feathers. But things become especially interesting when we turn to the dromaeosaur or raptor dinosaurs. Meet Microraptor, a crow-sized cousin of Velociraptor. It had not 2, but 4 proper wings, one on each limb. Some individuals who do not accept feathered dinosaurs have suggested that Microraptor was simply an unusual type of bird. While this animal certainly shares several features with birds, it has far more features in common with other non-avian theropod dinosaurs. For example, Microraptor has a long bony tail rather than a shortened tail ending in a pygostyle. It has toothed jaws instead of a beak, and its forelimbs have claws with free-moving digits rather than the fused hand bones we see in birds. While some modern birds, like the Hoatzin, do briefly have claws on their wings before reaching adulthood, these are not free-moving digits and are lost as the animal reaches adulthood. In addition to all of that, Microraptor had a raptorial foot with an enlarged sickle-shaped claw. This is a hallmark feature of dromaeosaurs like Velociraptor. While Microraptor did have proper wings, there is ongoing debate about whether it was capable of powered flight or primarily used its wings for gliding from tree to tree. I mentioned very early on in this talk that Velociraptor was covered in feathers, but I never provided any evidence for why we think that was the case. We have not yet found any fossilized feathers associated with a Velociraptor skeleton, yet, but we have found evidence that the feathers used to be there in the form of quill knobs. In modern birds, these are little bumps on the forelimb bones that serve as attachment points for wing feathers. When we look at Velociraptor forelimb bones, we see that they also had these quill knobs. This shows that in life, Velociraptor also would have had wings. Now, the wings don't appear to have been large enough to get the animal off the ground, so it's probably using them for display purposes, or perhaps to help with steering while in pursuit of prey. We can find another line of evidence for Velociraptor feathers in the form of Zhonhuan which is a cousin of Velociraptor. It looked very similar, was about the same size, and it had those characteristic raptor claws on the feet. Specimens of this animal have been found with wing, tail, and body feathers, so it gives us an idea of what Velociraptor would have looked like completely covered in feathers. This is Calindrodromeus, discovered in Russia. Now, this species is interesting for 2 reasons. First, it shows a mix of body coverings. Most dinosaurs appear to have been primarily covered in either scales or feathers, but Calindrodromeus displays both. Fossil specimens of this species preserve down-like filamentous feathers over much of the body, while the tail preserves scaly skin impressions similar to those seen in traditionally scaly dinosaurs. The second reason Calinda dromius stands out is that all of the feathered dinosaurs we've discovered so far are theropods. But Calinda dromius is not a theropod at all. It belongs to a completely different major group of dinosaurs known as Ornithischia. The discovery of Calinda dromius shows that feathers are not limited to bird-like theropods. For a long time, evolutionary paleontologists assumed that feathers were closely tied to the origin of birds from theropods. But Calinda dromius demonstrates that a dinosaur can have nothing to do with the evolution of birds and still possess feathers. And speaking of dinosaurs that mix scales and feathers, Psittacosaurus is another good example. This is a small member of the Ceratopsia group, the same group that includes animals like Triceratops. So again, this has nothing to do with the evolution of birds. Psittacosaurus was mostly covered in scales, which we know because, again, we have fossils of its skin preserved from most of its body. But it had bristle-like feathers running along the top of its tail. So far, we've seen feathers in theropods and even non-theropod dinosaurs. Surely the surprises end there, right? Actually, no. We now know that it wasn't just dinosaurs that had feather-like body coverings. Pterosaurs did as well. I want to be clear that evolutionary paleontologists do not consider pterosaurs to be birds, nor are they dinosaurs. As we discussed earlier, they represent an entirely separate group of flying reptiles. Unlike birds, pterosaurs did not fly using feathers. Their wings were made of skin membranes supported by elongated bones in the forelimb. Fossil evidence shows that many pterosaurs were covered in fine, down-like filaments. These structures were not used for flight, but likely served an insulating function, helping the animal regulate their body temperature. The animal shown here is Jeholopterus, a small pterosaur that in many ways probably looked and behaved a lot like modern bats. It had very large eyes, so scientists think it was nocturnal and flew around catching insects in the air. We even find feather-like body coverings in larger pterosaurs, such as Tupandactylus, which happens to be one of my personal favorite pterosaurs. This discovery was especially significant because it marks the first time researchers identified branching filamentous structures in a pterosaur. The preserved branching filaments occur along the base of the jaw and at the lower margin of its large, sail-shaped head crest. Now it's time to answer the big question, the one you all clicked on this video for. Did dinosaurs have feathers? Based on the fossil evidence, the answer is yes. What I've just shown you here represents only a small sample of the hundreds of feathered dinosaur specimens that have been discovered so far. Feathers are fairly common among theropod dinosaurs, the group evolutionary paleontologists associate with the ancestry of birds. But importantly, feathers are not restricted to theropods. We also see them in dinosaurs that are not closely related to birds at all. And beyond dinosaurs, we've seen that feather-like body coverings even appear in pterosaurs, animals that are not dinosaurs and not on the evolutionary lineage that resulted in birds. The increasing prevalence of feathered body coverings in the fossil record has led scientists to ask whether all dinosaurs had some form of filamentous covering in much the same way that all mammals have hair. This does not mean that animals like Brachiosaurus or Stegosaurus were covered head to toe in feathers. In mammals, we see a wide range of hair coverage. Sea otters, for example, have the densest fur coat on the planet. It helps keep them warm even in freezing cold water. Others have almost no hair at all. This photo on the right is a close-up view of a humpback whale's snout. And even though it's hard to see, yes, those are tiny whiskers on the top of the snout. Dinosaurs may have shown similar variation. Some species appear to have been largely covered in feathers, such as Sinosauropteryx or Microraptor. Others, like Psittacosaurus, seem to have had very limited feathering, restricted to specific regions of the body. This paints a very different picture of the animal world than the one we see today. In the modern world, birds are the only animals that have feathers, so it's easy to assume that feathers are a bird-only trait. But the fossil record shows that this assumption doesn't hold up. Feathers were not limited to birds. They also appear in non-avian dinosaurs and even pterosaurs. This shows us the danger of assuming that just because we see something today, it must have always been that way in the past. And if you think about what we know about God as creator, that actually makes a lot of sense. Even today, some animals are just, well, weird. Take the duck-billed platypus. It's a mammal, but it lays eggs and has a sprawling limb posture like a reptile, and it possesses an unusually complex sex chromosome system that shares similarities with the system used by birds. The bombardier beetle is another great example. When it's attacked by a predator, it actually sprays a jet of hot, noxious chemicals that are produced by a controlled chemical reaction inside of its body. It's hot enough to be near boiling point. And then you've got animals like the mud skipper. It's a fish, yet it can leave the water, breathe air through its skin and mouth lining, and crawl around on land using its fins. If animals as strange and unexpected as these exist today, is it really too hard for God to make a feathered reptile? Maybe feathered dinosaurs aren't really that weird after all. Today, most vertebrates, or animals with a backbone, fit into one of five categories: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, or fish. Generally speaking, this classification system works very well. But these are but a tiny picture of the total diversity of life God originally filled the world with. When we turn to the fossil record, things get a little bit more complicated. This talk has primarily focused on so-called dino birds, animals that share characteristics with both birds and other reptiles. But this kind of overlap in traits isn't unique to dinosaurs. We see it throughout the fossil record. I mentioned Dimetrodon earlier in this talk. It's a non-mammalian synapsid, an almost mammal, if you will. It has features that kind of look like those we see in reptiles and features that kind of look like those we see in mammals. But it doesn't really belong to either modern group. We see the same pattern with animals like Seymoria, which shares characteristics with both amphibians and reptiles. And we see it again in so-called fishopods, like Tiktaalik, which display a mix of fish and amphibian traits. This shows us that the modern diversity we see today is really just a snapshot of the much broader diversity God originally created. That does not mean the five-tier classification system we use for modern vertebrates is wrong or useless, of course. Again, it still works very well for living animals. But when we turn to the fossil record and try to understand the original design patterns of life, we will probably need to use a different approach. So let's take a look at Scripture and see what we can pull from there. We're going to turn to the event recorded on the third day of creation in Genesis 1:11. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plant yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, and which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. Turning to day 5 in Genesis 1:21, we read, "So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." And finally, we come to day 6 with Genesis 1:25. "And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind." I hope you're seeing the common term used here, according to its or their kind. So what exactly does that mean? What is this kinds concept about? When many people read the creation account in Genesis, they assume that God created all of the individual species we see on Earth today. But that assumption comes from reading a modern scientific concept back into a very ancient text. The biological concept of a species did not exist when the Bible was written. In fact, the modern species concept was not developed until the 17th and 18th centuries, most notably through the work of Carl Linnaeus, the founder of modern biological classification. As such, we should not expect Genesis to be describing the origin of modern species. The species concept simply did not exist at the time the biblical text was written. Instead, the Hebrew word translated as kind in Genesis is a non-technical term. It simply refers to a grouping or multiplicity of living things. It's used in much the same way we use the word today, like when we talk about different kinds of trees, different kinds of animals, or different kinds of birds. When we read the creation account with this in mind, the picture that emerges is not one of God creating every modern species individually. Rather, God is creating a world filled with distinct kinds of living things. By the end of creation week, the world is populated with different kinds of swimming creatures, different kinds of flying creatures, and different kinds of livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth, each created according to its kind. The challenge then is figuring out how these biblical kinds relate to the animals we see both in the modern world and in the fossil record. To answer this question, we can turn to a field of creationist research called Baraminology, which means the study of created kinds. Baraminology is a very active and dynamic field of research with its own conferences and technical publications, and new studies are published every year. A few years ago, I was a co-author on a baraminology study that examined giraffes. Evolutionary biologists believe that the giraffes evolved from a common ancestor with other ruminants. These are hoofed mammals that chew the cud, such as cows, deer, sheep, goats, and pronghorn. We wanted to use baraminology to test that hypothesis. To do this, we utilized statistical methods used in baraminology, including baraminic distance, which measures the percentage of anatomical characteristics, such as unique features of bones, skulls, and teeth, that two organisms have in common. This allowed us to assess how similar or dissimilar they are. We also used a clustering method called multidimensional scaling, which allows patterns of similarity and difference between organisms to be visualized in three-dimensional space. Our results showed that giraffes clustered together with the modern okapi and several extinct species within the Giraffoidea superfamily, which is the level above family in taxonomic classification. Other ruminants, however, consistently fell outside of this group. Based on these results, we proposed that Giraffoidea represents a single created kind. If this interpretation is correct, it means that God did not create modern giraffes, okapis, and extinct giraffoids as separate species in the beginning. Instead, he created an ancestral giraffe kind that later diversified into multiple species, including the giraffes we see today. Importantly, that ancestral giraffid could not be linked to other non-giraffoid animals in evolutionary history. So what does any of this have to do with dinosaurs? Well, many of these same methods can and have been applied to dinosaurs. Traditionally, creationists have tried to challenge the idea that birds evolved from non-avian dinosaurs by simply drawing a clear line between the two groups. But as we've seen from the fossil record, that line is not always easy to draw. Sure, it is easy to distinguish a modern bird like a parrot from a dinosaur like Tyrannosaurus rex. However, the fossil record also contains many animals that blur whatever boundary we attempt to place between birds and non-avian dinosaurs. Evolutionary paleontologists point to this pattern as evidence that birds are the modern descendants of non-avian dinosaurs. But a closer look at the mode of creation God used, creation according to kinds, suggests that this is the wrong way to approach the problem. Rather than trying to draw artificial lines between broad groups like birds and dinosaurs, we need to ask a different question. How do species naturally cluster into created kinds, just as the Bible describes? Before the first formal Baraminology studies of dinosaurs were conducted, creationists who accept the existence of feathered dinosaurs predicted that these animals would not form a single evolutionary continuum. Instead, they expected feathered dinosaurs to be represented by multiple and distinct created kinds, none of which would cluster with modern birds or with unrelated non-avian dinosaurs. So what does the evidence actually show? The first full-length study on the Baraminology of feathered dinosaurs was published in 2018 in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism. The lead author was paleontologist Dr. Matt McLain of the Masters University in Santa Clarita, California. This study analyzed 5 datasets, all focused on the theropods commonly thought to be most closely related to the ancestors of birds. The results identified 8 distinct kinds of feathered dinosaurs, several of which include species we've already discussed earlier in this talk. So let's briefly look at a few examples. One of the identified kinds corresponds to Compsognathidae, a family of small theropod dinosaurs. The most famous member of this family is Compsognathus itself, which you might recognize from the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World films as the small dinosaurs portrayed attacking prey in groups. This same family also includes Sinosauropteryx, one of the feathered dinosaurs we examined earlier. Another feathered dinosaur kind was Therizinosauridia, which is classified as a superfamily in standard taxonomic hierarchy. Members of this group ranged in size from the black bear-sized Beipiaosaurus we discussed earlier to the massive Therizinosaurus itself, one of the largest known theropods and a recent addition to the Jurassic World Dominion film. A third created kind of feathered dinosaurs was Tyrannosauroidea, which in standard taxonomy is classified as a superfamily. Tyrannosaurus rex is by far the most famous member of this group. As we discussed earlier, tyrannosaurs show considerable variation in body covering. T-Rex itself appears to have been primarily covered in scales based on preserved skin impressions, whereas its relative, Eutyrannus, was covered in thick, down-like plumage. Finally, we come to Deinonychosauria, the group that includes the well-known raptor dinosaurs like Microraptor, Deinonychus, and Velociraptor. These animals are often cited as the strongest evidence for the evolutionary origin of birds. Yet, when baraminology methods are applied, Deinonychosaurs are consistently recovered as a distinct created kind that does not cluster with modern birds. Taken together, these results show that feathered dinosaurs do not form a single evolutionary bridge to birds. Instead, they fall into multiple, well-defined created kinds. As we wrap up this presentation, I would like to briefly summarize the main takeaways. First, feathers are not a bird-only trait in the fossil record. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that feathers and feather-like body coverings occur in non-avian theropods, non-theropod dinosaurs, and even pterosaurs. Second, feathered dinosaurs do not require acceptance of bird evolution. The presence of feathers in dinosaurs is often framed as automatic evidence for evolution. But as we have shown, this is a false dilemma. Scripture clearly places birds and land animals on different creation days. And just because 2 types of animals share features in common, like feathers, does not mean they evolved from a common ancestor. Third, the Bible's framework of creation according to kinds explains why fossil animals don't always fit neatly into modern animal categories. Genesis is not describing the creation of modern species, but kinds. The word kind is a flexible, non-technical term referring to real biological groupings. Fossil animals often blur modern categories because those categories are post-creation snapshots, and they do not reflect the original diversity God filled the world with. And fourth, feathered dinosaurs represent multiple created kinds, not an evolutionary bridge to birds. The field of baraminology provides a testable way to identify created kinds. When applied to feathered dinosaurs, it consistently recovers them as multiple distinct kinds. Even groups often cited as smoking gun ancestors of birds, such as the Deinonychosaurs, cluster separately from birds. Feathered dinosaurs are not an affront to biblical creation, nor are they undeniable proof of bird evolution. Rather, they are a beautiful and wonderful expression of God's creativity in the world around us. May he forever be praised. How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Psalm 104, verse 24, English Standard Version. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. If you would like to see more of my work, please check out my educational science mystery series, Cozy and the Chrononauts. You can find it at www.cozyandthechrononauts.com. If you would like to learn more about feathered dinosaurs, baraminology, the meaning of the word kind, or any other topics I addressed, please check out the description box below for more resources. And if you found this video helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads from Chrononaut Central. For now, this is Christian Ryan from Chrononaut Central, signing off.